Welcome, board game soloists, to Top Solo Games. I'm J. Allen Riker, horror author. Yeah, so half of my content used to be top 5 lists. But recently, while I feel very confident in sharing my opinion of specific games, maybe too confident, I haven't felt expert enough to make lists, which is silly because they were always lists of my personal favorite games of any given sort. But one area where I feel very comfortable with calling myself an expert is horror. Besides being a horror author, I also read a good amount of horror fiction and watch horror movies almost daily. So this is my list of my favorite soloable horror games. First, we're going to do an honorable mention. This is definitely one of the most popular horror games, one whose mission would cause people to discount everything else that I have to say. But it is a game that I don't play because I play Marvel Champions, and that is expensive enough. And that game, as you can guess, is Arkham Horror, the card game. In horror, the protagonist needs to be fragile. Something can be horror-themed, but not horror, if the protagonist is able to truly fight back without enormous sacrifice. In Arkham Horror, I definitely felt fragile. And the subject of the game, of course, is Lovecraftian horror, one of the very darkest of all horror subgenres, in which people think is just about fungus monsters with tentacles, but which is really about a universe that we can't possibly understand, in which our only hope is to avoid the notice of forces that dwarf us and could obliviously crush us in their passing. So I just gave a description that rules a lot of things that have horror themes out of being actually horror, and number 5 probably falls into that. Its protagonists are well equipped to deal with the monsters of the world, making it a lot more dark fantasy than horror. From what I have played so far, there's a lot of game here, and so I haven't seen it all. But I'm going to make an exception for this still unnamed game because it is exceptional and one that not enough people have played. And that game is Apocrypha adventure game. Apocrypha is the original adventure card game. Pathfinder was published first because they licensed the system to Paizo and they were just more on the ball. But I think that Apocrypha is actually better. The adventures, I think, are more distinct and fun. I like the dice pool system more. It's much easier to calculate the odds when using all D6s instead of a mix of your standard like D&D dice. The thrill of luck is still there, but because you actually get the push your luck feel more because you can calculate the odds of how likely you are to hit a certain threshold with a given number of dice, and that gives you a little bit more reason to dedicate precious resources to any given challenge. Instead of traditional fantasy, Apocrypha is dark fantasy like Supernatural or Buffy or the Dresden Files, and even with a little bit of that sense of humor. The rules of the scenarios are constructed by a sentence that describes it, which is so cool, but is impossible to explain and actually kind of hard to understand even when it's right in front of you, to the degree where there's actually a resource on here where it will explain each sentence to you and what rules the mission therefore entails. Setup in this game is a bear. It is a little bit difficult to learn. I would actually suggest that you get the Pathfinder card app. That's the route that I went unintentionally. I just wanted to try Pathfinder adventure card game. And so it was relatively easy to learn Apocrypha, but I can imagine it being very hard. But besides those drawbacks, this is an excellent game. My number 4 entry is a game that I sold, but only because it ended up being so worth so much on the secondhand market that it didn't make sense to keep it for as much as I played it and as much as I foresaw playing it. But the plays that I did have of it were a very solid horror experience with a lot of tension. And that game is Subterra. It has you delving into the earth, hoping to find your escape before your light goes dark. You've basically fallen as you're exploring a cave, I guess, and you have to try to find your way out. After your light goes out, you do have a couple of rounds to crawl to the exit through the dark, if you can find it, as you are attacked on all sides. And it is a truly intense experience. So in Subterra, at some point, in like kind of undescribed creatures that are just claws and fangs in the darkness begin pursuing you as you explore tile after tile, hoping to just get to the end of the cave and not hit a dead end. Unless you have selected the player character type of bodyguard, I don't think that you can even fight them. Each character type has an ability like that allows you to survive in the cave you've fallen into. A medic can patch your wounds, an engineer can create new paths with dynamite. This game has had me literally almost holding my breath. It's a tight game every time, and you can feel the claustrophobia as you just hope that the cave continues before you as monsters close in behind you. I do wonder about the longevity of Subterra because of the lack of variety, but the horror vibes it provides are perfect. There's a second one that I think is actually easier to find, where you are exploring a temple to grab an artifact, but it seems like it's more adventure and less horror from the comments that I've seen. So my number 3 entry is a game where you can't die, but the monster still feels terrifying. That is Alien: Fate of the Nostromo. Sharing this spot is Horrified, which is very similar, but for some reason, maybe it's just the classic monsters. I think the board is a little bit, has more paths on it. I never felt the tension in it, although I do thoroughly enjoy the game. I never felt the tension and the horror that I do when playing Alien: Fate of the Nostromo. This game truly feels like living through a version of the first Alien movie, which, while it gets categorized sometimes as sci-fi, honestly is a haunted house movie in space. There are a handful of different scenarios, but each has you moving around the Nostromo, the tight corridors, trying to repair or access different ship functions while avoiding the alien coming right at you. And if that's not intense enough, you can bring science officer android Ash into the mix, where he tries to make sure that you fail in your attempts to defeat the xenomorph. The relentlessness of the xenomorph, along with your inability to really harm it, and along with a great little mini, make it a real thrill to flip the card to see if the xenomorph makes it all the way to wherever you are on the ship. There's definitely a bit of push your luck as you choose how near to get to the alien, because moving suboptimally can easily have you running out of time. But if that alien draws a high movement card, it will set you back even further. So my heart rate tends to go up as I'm, preparing to flip that card over and see how much trouble I'm in. Now, my number 2 entry is definitely far more deadly. You will spend a lot of time dying, and a lot of little yellow meeples will die first as they get caught in the wake of a slasher hunting you down. And that game, as you probably guessed, is Final Girl. Final Girl has that mix and match aspect that that I love so much. The location makes a huge difference. It provides a bunch of different cards and items and rules, and so does the slasher. And to some extent, the Final Girl that you choose also provides something a little different. The locations and the slashers, though, are their own separate boards that pull away from a little box, which is universally agreed to be a fantastic form factor. So, sure, you can take one side of the box and the other side of the box, and you can play a xenomorph on a spaceship. But you can also set the xenomorph aside and move in Hans reenacting Jason X, or as some people know it, Friday the 13th in space. Final Girl took the board game world by storm in a way that I wish that horror fiction would catch back on again. The game often feels unfair, and yet how could it be any other way? It's always so thematically on point that you can't get mad at it for doing what it said it was going to do. I do wish the Final Girl had a career mode like Hostage Negotiator, because I think that having the unfair losses spread across a career instead of being, your entire game would help mitigate the negative feelings. But losing as a hostage negotiator means someone else meets a bad end. Losing as a Final Girl, well, Final Girl, despite being many, many people's number one solo game, isn't my number one solo horror game. No, my favorite is one that's going to make people miffed, positively ticked. But I don't care, I have to go with my heart. My number one favorite horror game is more of a series. It is Zombicide. Now, I'm going to talk about Marvel Zombies specifically because it is my favorite. However, it does require a certain adjustment of the rules to meet the maximum horror amount that I get from other entries in the series. And I'll get into that. I know that's a confusing thing to say. Now, I know what you're thinking. Marvel Zombies, you're superheroes. And even in Zombicide, the other entries, you're more powerful than any given zombie. You're blowing them away. It's beer and pretzels, right? You're mowing them down from a couple of spaces away often. So you're hardly powerless. So wouldn't Cthulhu Death May Die be a more appropriate Come On and Eric Lang game for this list? I definitely could have included it, but I think one Come On Eric Lang game is probably enough for the list. And I'm going to explain why I think Zombicide actually provides more horror, even at the same time that it is more action-oriented. Zombicide, while it initially has you handling the bad guys pretty easily, always ends with you being completely overwhelmed. You can never beat the monster. You win only by escaping. A zombie swarm is a natural disaster in a particularly gruesome form. You can't defeat it by taking out a zombie or 5 or 10 any more than you can save your city by punching a hurricane. That's even more true to horror than Cthulhu Death May Die. Now, Marvel Zombies is supposed to be a really difficult version of Zombicide, but from what I can tell, it's balanced exactly the same, except that you lose if anyone dies. So it's the same exact balance with one different rule, which to some degree I ignore. I keep playing just like I would in any other Zombicide that I've played. And that to me is something that really lends to the horror of the game series. Members of your party have to peel off to make last stands just to buy the rest of you time to make it another square. That exact thing happens in almost every horror movie. Not as much in horror novels, but definitely in almost every horror movie. You have people making last stands. Sacrifice is a key to horror. If you can win without sacrifice, it was just action with horror trappings. No game in which you beat the monster is as true to horror as Zombicide, where you just hope to fall over the finish line with one person while you fully realize that the world is going to end in the next scene. Like, the curtains fall, but a massive swarm of zombies is right on your tail. We know how this ends. We've all seen the post-credit scenes of zombie movies. So, those are my top 5 horror games, and I'm a horror author, so don't disagree with me in the comments. But feel free to mention your favorite horror or horror-themed games. There are always a ton of horror games on crowdfunding, but I can't ever tell if they're really horror or just gory and edgy, and I don't usually buy first editions of games unless I'm like really excited about it and don't think I can get it otherwise. So I definitely could have missed some good horror games. Let me know. That's it from me, J. Allen Riker, wishing you a great rest of your day and reminding you to keep playing solo.